Three armed men had her cornered in the alley behind the general store, their intentions written clear in their leering grins, when a rifle shot split the autumn air. Vivienne Laurent didn't scream. She stood perfectly still, her elegant posture unwavering even as rough hands reached for her travel cloak. The stranger who fired that warning shot was Rowan Cade, a man whose silence was as legendary as his skill with a gun. What he saw in that alley wasn't a helpless society woman, but something that would either save his failing ranch or destroy everything he'd fought to protect. If you want to see how an elegant widow transformed a struggling frontier ranch into an empire, stay until the end. Like this video and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Ash Hollow's only boarding house, sending up a cloud of dust that coated everything within 10 feet. Vivienne Laurent stepped down without waiting for the driver's assistance, her gloved hand gripping the doorframe with practiced steadiness. At 42, she moved with the kind of grace that came from years of formal dinners and ballroom floors, not from frontier practicality. She was overdressed for this place. Everyone could see it. Her traveling dress, though worn at the seams and carefully mended, still held the cut of expensive Boston tailoring. The burgundy fabric had faded in places, but the lines were unmistakable. Her dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was pinned in an elaborate style that wouldn't survive a week of wind and dust. She wore no jewelry except a simple wedding band she'd kept out of habit, not sentiment. The driver hauled down her two trunks, everything she owned in the world now, and set them in the street without ceremony. "This is it, ma'am. Ash Hollow." Vivienne surveyed the town with eyes that revealed nothing. A single rutted street, buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together by men in a hurry to get drunk. A saloon that was doing steady business even at 3 in the afternoon. This was the kind of place people came to when they'd run out of better options, just like her. "Thank you," she said quietly, pressing a coin into the driver's palm. He tipped his hat and climbed back up without another word. The stage rolled away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the street with her trunks and her dignity. Within 30 seconds, she felt the stares. Men loitering outside the saloon, women peering through shop windows. A group of cowboys on horseback had actually stopped to watch her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to something far less innocent. In a town like this, a woman traveling alone was either desperate or dangerous. Vivienne was learning to be both. She lifted her chin and started walking toward the boarding house, her posture as straight as it had been at every society function she'd ever attended. Let them stare. She'd survived worse than judgment. The boarding house keeper was a pinched-faced woman named Mrs. Brennan, who looked Vivienne over with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock. "You'll want the room at the end of the hall. $2 a week, paid in advance. No men, no drinking, no noise after 9. Vivienne set the bills on the counter without comment. "You here looking for work?" Mrs. Brennan's tone suggested she already knew the answer and found it amusing. "Yes." "Doing what exactly?" "I'm an excellent cook. I also have experience managing households." Mrs. Brennan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Well, that's something. Most women who come through here can't boil water without setting themselves on fire. But I'll tell you now, this town doesn't have much use for fancy cooking or household management. You might want to reconsider your plans." "I appreciate the advice," Vivienne said evenly. "Which room was it again?" She carried her own trunks upstairs, refusing help from the stable boy Mrs. Brennan called over. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a window that looked out over the street and a door that locked from the inside. That was all she needed. Vivienne unpacked with methodical precision. Her few remaining dresses, each one carefully maintained despite years of wear, a small collection of books, cooking tools wrapped in linen, a leather journal filled with recipes she'd perfected over decades, and at the very bottom of the second trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, a silver-framed photograph of a life she would never return to. She set the photograph face down in the trunk and closed the lid. By evening, she'd learned several important things about Ash Hollow. First, the town existed primarily to serve the surrounding ranches, which meant the population swelled on weekends when cowboys came in for supplies and entertainment. Second, there were exactly 3 businesses that might hire a woman for legitimate work: the boarding house, the general store, and the restaurant attached to the saloon. Third, none of them were hiring. "We don't need help," the store owner told her flatly, And even if we did, you're not the right fit. The restaurant manager didn't even let her finish her introduction. No offense, lady, but you look like you'd faint at the sight of a slaughtered pig. This isn't the kind of kitchen you're used to. By the time the sun set, Vivian had exhausted every option she could think of. She stood on the boarding house porch, watching the street come alive with the rough energy of men who worked hard and played harder. Laughter and piano music spilled from the saloon. Somewhere down the street, a fight broke out and resolved itself with the efficiency of frequent practice. She was wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake coming here when she noticed the three men. They'd been watching her earlier. She recognized them from the group outside the saloon. Now they were crossing the street with the kind of deliberate purpose that made her pulse quicken. She turned to go inside, but one of them was already at the porch steps. "Evening, ma'am." He smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. "We noticed you're new in town." "Good evening, gentlemen. If you'll excuse me, don't be in such a hurry." The second man moved to block her path to the door. "We're just being neighborly. This can be a rough town for a woman on her own. You might need some protection." The third man circled around behind her, cutting off any retreat down the side alley. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite capable of looking after myself. Are you, though?" The first man stepped onto the porch, close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like you could use a friend or two." "I'm not interested in friendship at the moment. Please step aside." Instead of moving, he reached out and fingered the fabric of her sleeve. "That's fine material. You must have been somebody important back wherever you came from. What brings a lady like you to a place like this?" "That's none of your concern. Maybe we should make it our concern." His smile widened. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go have a drink, and you can tell us all about—" The rifle shot cracked through the evening air like a thunderclap. All four of them froze. Vivian's ears rang from the proximity of the blast. The man who'd been touching her sleeve jerked his hand back as if burned. Slowly, they all turned to see who had fired. A man stood in the street, his rifle still pointed at the sky. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hard stone as the surrounding mountains. He wore range clothes, dusty, practical, worn, and there was nothing soft or civilized about him. "The lady said she's not interested," he said quietly. His voice carried despite its low volume, cutting through the noise of the street with unnerving clarity. The man on the porch bristled. "This doesn't concern you, Cade." "I'm making it my concern, Porter. Now step away from her." Porter's face flushed with anger and humiliation, but he didn't move toward the stranger called Cade. Instead, he looked at Vivian with something ugly in his expression. "You'll regret this," he said, then gestured to his companions. "Let's go." They left, but not before each of them shot looks at Cade that promised future violence. Vivian's hands were shaking. She clasped them together and turned to face her unexpected defender. "Thank you," she said. "I'm grateful for your intervention." Rowan Cade studied her with eyes the color of winter slate. He didn't return her polite smile. He didn't offer reassurances. He just looked at her like he was trying to solve a complicated problem. "You're the woman who came in on the afternoon stage," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Vivienne Laurent." He nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "You're looking for work." "I am, though I haven't had much success so far." "Can you cook?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes, very well, actually." "Can you manage a household, keep accounts, handle men who don't always want to be handled?" "I've been doing exactly that for 20 years. Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, but a reassessment. "My ranch cook quit 3 days ago, walked off in the middle of dinner service and never came back. I've got 12 men eating burned beans and threatening mutiny. If you can actually do what you claim, I'll hire you, room and board included, plus $30 a month." Vivian's breath caught. $30 was more than she'd dared hope for, but she'd learned to be cautious about offers that sounded too good. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I'm lying about my qualifications." "You might be," Cade acknowledged, "but I watched you handle Porter and his friends. You were terrified, but you didn't show it. You kept your voice level, your posture straight. That takes discipline. If you can bring that same discipline to a kitchen and a crew of cowboys, you'll earn every penny. And if I can't, then you'll leave and we'll both have wasted our time." He paused. "But I don't think that's going to happen." Vivian studied him in return. There was something about this man, a quality of absolute stillness, that suggested deep waters running beneath a calm surface. He wasn't offering charity. He was making a business arrangement based on mutual need. "When would you need me to start?" "Tonight, if you can manage it. Tomorrow morning at the latest." "And the ranch is 6 miles west of town, the Triple C. We run cattle and horses." His expression remained neutral, but she caught something in his tone, a hint of pride maybe, or possessiveness. "It's not easy work. The kitchen is in bad shape. The men are used to doing things their own way. You'll have to establish authority fast or they'll run right over you." "I understand." "Do you?" Cade's gaze sharpened. "Because you look like you walked out of a Boston parlor, Mrs. Laurent. This isn't that world. This is early mornings, hot kitchens, and men who won't respect you just because you say please and thank you." Vivian lifted her chin. "Mr. Cade, I appreciate your concern for my delicate sensibilities, but I assure you I'm quite capable of handling difficult men and difficult work. If I weren't, I wouldn't have survived the journey here." For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. It was gone before she could be certain. "Fair enough," he said. "Get your things. I'll have someone bring around a wagon." "Now? Tonight?" "Unless you'd rather spend the night here and risk another encounter with Porter." He had a point. Vivian nodded and went inside to collect her trunks. 20 minutes later, she was sitting beside Rowan Cade on the bench of a sturdy ranch wagon, her belongings loaded in the back. The sun had set completely now, and the darkness beyond the town lights was absolute. She'd never experienced darkness like this. No street lamps, no neighboring houses, nothing but stars and the sound of the horses' hooves on packed earth. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, more to break the silence than because she expected a detailed answer. Cade was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond at all. Then he said, "It's been in my family for 15 years. My father started it, built it up from nothing. He died 4 years ago and left it to me. We run about 2,000 head of cattle and breed working horses. The land is good, plenty of water, decent grazing. But we've had some trouble lately." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that comes from neighbors who want what you have." His tone discouraged further questions, so Vivian fell silent. She studied his profile in the moonlight. The strong jaw, the deep-set eyes, the mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably in his mid-30s, but he carried himself with the weariness of someone much older. They rode for what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes. Then Cade pulled the wagon to a stop and pointed. "There." Vivian followed his gesture and saw lights in the distance, warm yellow squares against the darkness. As they drew closer, she could make out the shapes of buildings. A large main house, several outbuildings, a massive barn, corrals spreading out in multiple directions. It was bigger than she'd expected, more established. "How many people work here?" she asked. 12 hands full-time, plus seasonal workers during roundup. They bunk in the main house during winter, separate quarters in summer. "And the household staff?" "Until 3 days ago, we had a cook. Now we have you." Vivian absorbed this information. No housekeeper, no maid service, no butler or footman, or any of the dozens of people who'd maintained the household she'd known before. Just her, 12 cowboys, and a man who clearly preferred silence to conversation. She smiled despite herself. This would be interesting. The wagon pulled into the yard, and immediately several men appeared from the barn. They looked at Vivian with undisguised curiosity and varying degrees of skepticism. "Boss," one of them said, a grizzled older man with a magnificent mustache. "This is the new cook?" "This is Mrs. Laurent," Cade said, climbing down and offering Vivian his hand. "She'll be starting tonight. Make sure her things get to the house." "Tonight?" The man's eyebrows shot up. "But it's past 8. Then I suggest you show her to the kitchen quickly, Sam, so she can assess the situation." Sam looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. Instead, he turned to Vivian with an expression of deep doubt. "Ma'am, I should warn you that the kitchen is, well, It's not in the best condition. I'd like to see it, Vivian said calmly. What she saw when Sam opened the kitchen door made her seriously question her decision to come here. The room was a disaster. Dishes were piled in the dry sink, some crusted with what looked like days-old food. The massive cast-iron stove was coated in grease and ash. The work surfaces were cluttered with abandoned cooking projects, spilled flour, and unidentifiable stains. The floor hadn't been swept in recent memory, and the smell, a combination of burned food, rotting scraps, and general neglect, made her eyes water. The last cook wasn't much for cleaning, Sam said apologetically. We've been trying to manage on our own, but I can see that. Vivian set down her bag and rolled up her sleeves. How many men need to eat breakfast tomorrow morning? 13, including the boss. We usually eat at 6. She checked the clock on the wall. 8:30. That gave her 9.5 hours to make this kitchen functional and prepare a meal for 13 hungry men. I'll need hot water, she said briskly. Lots of it, and soap, and someone to take out these garbage bins and bring me fresh ones. Sam blinked. You're going to clean tonight? I can't cook in this. Yes, I'm going to clean tonight unless you'd prefer to eat burned beans again tomorrow. No, ma'am. A hint of respect had entered his voice. I'll get you what you need. For the next 4 hours, Vivian worked with the focused intensity of someone who had something to prove. She scrubbed the stove until the cast iron gleamed. She washed dishes until her hands were raw. She swept and mopped the floor, organized the pantry, sharpened the knives, and inventoried the supplies. The kitchen was better stocked than she'd expected. Someone had been ordering quality ingredients, even if they didn't know what to do with them. Around midnight, Rowan Cade appeared in the doorway. He'd changed into clean clothes and washed the trail dust from his face and hands. He looked at the transformed kitchen with something that might have been surprise. You didn't have to do all this tonight, he said. Vivian wrung out the mop and leaned it against the wall. Yes, I did. If I'm going to cook in this kitchen, it needs to meet my standards. And if I'm going to earn the respect of your men, they need to see that I mean business. You've made your point. He moved into the room and picked up one of the clean knives, testing its edge with his thumb. These are sharp. Dull knives are dangerous. They slip. He set the knife down carefully. Sam says you asked about provisions for breakfast. What do you need? Nothing tonight. You have eggs, bacon, flour, butter, cream. That's enough for what I have planned. She paused, studying him. Mr. Cade, I need to understand the situation here. Why did your last cook leave so suddenly? His expression closed off. That's not your concern. I think it is, if I'm going to be living and working here. Was there a problem with payment, with the accommodations, with the men? The men have nothing to do with it. His voice was sharp. I don't discuss my personal business with employees. I'm not asking out of idle curiosity. I'm asking because I need to know if there are problems I should be prepared to handle. They stared at each other for a long moment. Vivian refused to look away first. Finally, Cade said, There's been trouble with the neighboring ranch, sabotage, threats. Marta, the cook, got scared and left. Can't say I blame her. If you want to back out now, I'll drive you back to town in the morning. Is the danger immediate? No. Then I'm staying, but I appreciate the honesty. He nodded once, turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. Mrs. Laurent, the room at the top of the stairs is yours. It has a lock. Use it. After he'd gone, Vivian stood in the quiet kitchen and let herself absorb the full weight of what she'd agreed to. She was in a remote ranch, 6 miles from the nearest town, working for a man she didn't know, surrounded by men who had no reason to trust her. The previous cook had fled because of threats and sabotage. Any sensible woman would leave at first light, but Vivian had learned that sensible women didn't always survive what life threw at them. Sometimes you had to be bold instead of sensible. Sometimes you had to take risks that terrified you. She checked the stove one more time, banked the fire for the morning, and went upstairs to her new room. It was simple but clean, a real bed with a thick mattress, a wardrobe, a washstand, a small desk by the window, and a chair. Her trunks had been brought up and placed at the foot of the bed. Someone, probably Sam, had left a pitcher of fresh water and clean towels. Vivian locked the door, unpinned her hair, and sat down heavily on the bed. Her back ached. Her hands were raw from scrubbing. She smelled like lye soap and wood smoke. She'd never felt more alive. At 5 the next morning, she was back in the kitchen. She lit the stove, set coffee to boil, and began preparing breakfast with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. By the time the first cowboys stumbled in at 5:45, the kitchen smelled like heaven. There were biscuits, light and flaky, the kind that melted in your mouth. Scrambled eggs cooked with cream and butter until they were clouds. Bacon fried to perfect crispness. Hash-browned potatoes seasoned with onions and sage. Fresh jam she'd found in the pantry. And coffee so strong and perfectly brewed that the first man who tasted it actually stopped mid-sip and stared at his cup in disbelief. "Holy hell," he breathed. The other men crowded into the kitchen, drawn by the smell. They looked at the food, then at Vivian, then at each other with expressions of stunned reverence. Sam was the first to fill his plate. He took a bite of biscuit, closed his eyes, and made a sound that was almost spiritual. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't know what the boss is paying you, but it's not enough." The others murmured agreement, too busy eating to form coherent sentences. Rowan Cade was the last to arrive. He surveyed the scene, his men eating like they'd never seen food before. The spotless kitchen, Vivian standing at the stove with flour on her apron and satisfaction in her eyes, and something in his expression shifted. He filled a plate, took a bite, and for just a moment his careful mask slipped. He looked almost grateful. "This is acceptable," he said, which from him was probably the equivalent of effusive praise. Vivian hid her smile. "I'm glad it meets your standards, Mr. Cade." After breakfast, as the men dispersed to start their work, Sam lingered behind to help with dishes. "Mrs. Laurent," he said quietly, "I don't know what brought you to Ash Hollow, and I don't need to know, but I want you to understand something. We haven't had a real meal in this house since Rowan's mother died 3 years ago. What you gave us this morning, that wasn't just food, that was hope." "It was just breakfast, Mr. Sam." "No, ma'am, it wasn't." He dried the last plate and set it carefully in the cupboard. "You're going to be good for this place. I can feel it. Just watch yourself. The trouble the boss mentioned, it's real. And it's getting worse." "I understand." "Do you?" Sam's eyes were serious. "Because Silas Vane, the man who's been causing problems, he doesn't play fair. He wants this ranch, and he'll do whatever it takes to get it. Good people have already been hurt. I'd hate to see you become another casualty." Vivian met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Sam, I've survived worse than a land dispute. I'll be fine." "I hope so, ma'am. I truly do." After he left, Vivian stood at the window and looked out over the ranch. The sun was fully up now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Cowboys were working in the corrals, horses were running in the pastures, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear cattle lowing. This place was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. It demanded strength. It rewarded resilience. It had no patience for weakness or pretense. Vivienne Laurent had spent 20 years being exactly what society expected her to be, decorative, obedient, silent about things that mattered. She'd perfected the art of smiling while dying inside, of maintaining grace under the weight of other people's cruelty. But that woman was gone now, buried somewhere between Boston and Ash Hollow. This woman, the one standing in this frontier kitchen with raw hands and a straight spine, was something new, something harder, something that refused to break no matter how much pressure was applied. She turned back to her work, mentally planning the midday meal. The men would need something substantial. They were doing hard physical labor in cold weather. Beef stew, maybe, with fresh bread. And for dinner, roasted chicken with root vegetables and pie. As she worked, she heard sounds from elsewhere in the house. Boots on floorboards, voices raised in argument about something work-related, doors opening and closing. This house was full of life in a way that made her chest ache with something she didn't want to examine too closely. Around mid-morning, Rowan Cade returned to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her knead bread dough with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it thousands of times. "You settling in all right?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." "If you need anything, supplies, equipment, whatever, tell Sam and he'll make sure you get it." "I will." He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, still watching her work. It should have made her nervous, but somehow it didn't. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Laurent?" "Of course." "What brought you to Ash Hollow?" A woman with your obvious education and refinement, this seems like an unlikely destination. Vivian's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their rhythm. I needed a fresh start. Ash Hollow seemed as good a place as any. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm prepared to give right now. He accepted this with a nod. Fair enough. We all have things we'd rather not discuss. He pushed away from the doorframe. That breakfast this morning, I wasn't exaggerating when I said it was acceptable. It was the best meal I've eaten in years. You have a real gift. Thank you. I'm trusting you with something important here, he continued. These men work hard. They deserve to be fed well. But more than that, they deserve to feel like this is a home, not just a place they sleep between shifts. Marta, she was a decent cook, but she never understood that. You do. How can you tell? The way you arranged the table this morning. The fresh flowers in the center. The cloth napkins instead of the rags we'd been using. Those are small things, but they matter. They tell men they're valued. Vivian felt something warm unfold in her chest. I'm glad you noticed. I notice everything, Mrs. Laurent. His tone was matter-of-fact, not boastful. It's how I've kept this ranch running despite everything working against me. Can I ask you something now? You can ask. I may not answer. Why did you help me last night? You didn't know me. For all you knew, I could have been exactly what Porter assumed. Someone looking for protection in exchange for other services. Rowan's jaw tightened. Is that what you think I wanted? No, she said immediately, but I'm curious why you were so certain I wasn't that kind of woman. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. My mother was from Boston, originally. Came west when she married my father, even though everyone told her she was too refined for frontier life. She proved them all wrong. Built this house, established the standards that made it a home, earned the respect of every man who worked here. He paused. When I saw you standing on that porch last night, the way you held yourself, the way you spoke, you reminded me of her. I couldn't just walk away. Vivian's throat tightened. That's a lovely compliment. Thank you. It's just the truth. He moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. The lock on your door. Make sure you use it every night. Most of the men here are decent, but we hire seasonal hands I don't always know well. Better safe than sorry. I understand. After he left, Vivian stood at her work table and let herself feel the full weight of this strange new life. She was cooking in a frontier kitchen, living in a house full of men she didn't know, working for someone who paid attention to flowers on the breakfast table and believed in treating his employees with dignity. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cooking, cleaning, and learning the rhythm of the ranch. She served the midday meal, the beef stew had been a success, and spent the afternoon preparing dinner and familiarizing herself with the kitchen's quirks. The oven ran hot on the left side. The pump outside the back door sometimes stuck. The flour bin had a small hole that needed patching. By evening, she'd transformed the kitchen from chaos to order, and the men had started treating her with a respect that bordered on reverence. They removed their hats when they entered her domain. They said please and thank you. They offered to help with heavy lifting without being asked. Vivian had managed many households, commanded entire staffs, orchestrated elaborate social events, but she'd never felt as satisfied as she did watching these hardworking men enjoy food she'd prepared with her own hands. That night, after everyone had been fed and the kitchen was clean, she sat down at the small desk in her room and opened her journal. She'd been keeping it since leaving Boston, a record of this strange journey into a life she'd never imagined. Day 1 at the Triple C Ranch, she wrote. I have survived. More than that, I may have found something worth fighting for. She set down her pen and looked out the window at the stars. They were brighter here than anywhere she'd ever seen, so thick they looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. Somewhere in the house below, she heard men laughing. It was a good sound, warm and genuine, the kind of laughter that came from contentment rather than cruelty. Vivienne Laurent, who had once believed her life was over, who had come west carrying nothing but loss and the desperate hope that she might rebuild something from the ruins, allowed herself a small smile. This was just the beginning. The first real test came on her third morning at the ranch. Vivienne was up before dawn as usual, moving through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. She'd just pulled the first batch of biscuits from the oven when she heard raised voices outside. Through the window, she saw two of the younger ranch hands squaring off near the barn, their faces flushed with anger. "I told you to fix that fence yesterday, Riley. And I told you I had to help Jack with the horses. You're not my boss, Connor." "No, but I've been here 3 years longer than you, and I know what needs doing." "Boys," Sam's voice cut through the argument like a knife. "We don't have time for this. Get to work, both of you." They separated reluctantly, still glaring at each other. Vivienne watched the tension ripple through the morning routine, saw how it affected the other men. By the time they filed in for breakfast, the atmosphere was strained and hostile. She served the meal without comment, but she paid attention. Connor sat at one end of the table, Riley at the other. The men between them were careful not to take sides, but the division was there, subtle and dangerous. Rowan noticed it too. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just ate his breakfast with his usual silence and left for the day's work. After the men had gone, Vivienne cleaned up and thought about what she'd witnessed. Tension like that didn't appear overnight. It festered, built over time, fed by stress and exhaustion, and the kind of close quarters that could turn small irritations into major conflicts. She'd seen it before, in households where servants competed for favor or where family members turned on each other under pressure. The solution was never confrontation. It was creating space for people to remember why they were on the same side. That evening, she made a decision. Instead of the simple dinner she'd planned, she prepared a feast. Roasted beef with herb gravy, mashed potatoes whipped with cream and butter, fresh bread still warm from the oven, glazed carrots, apple pie with lattice crust. And in the center of the table, she placed a handwritten note on good paper she'd found in Rowan's study. "In appreciation for your hard work and dedication, VL." When the men came in and saw what she'd prepared, they stopped in their tracks. "Ma'am," Sam said quietly, "this looks like Thanksgiving dinner. What's the occasion?" "No occasion," Vivienne replied. "I simply wanted you to know that your efforts are noticed and valued." Riley, the younger ranch hand who'd been arguing that morning, looked at the table with something like wonder in his eyes. "My ma used to make dinners like this. Before—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. Connor, standing on the opposite side of the room, spoke up. "Mine too. Sunday dinners after church." His voice was rough with emotion he was trying to hide. For a moment, the hostility between them dissolved, replaced by shared memory of homes they'd left behind, mothers who'd cared for them, lives that had been simpler and softer than this hard frontier existence. "Well," Sam said, clearing his throat, "let's not let it get cold." They ate together that night in a way they hadn't before. The conversation flowed more easily. Men who'd been eating in silence for months started sharing stories about where they'd come from, what had brought them west, the families they'd left behind or lost along the way. Riley and Connor didn't become friends exactly, but the sharp edge of their conflict softened. Rowan arrived late, just as Vivienne was serving the pie. He looked at the scene, his men relaxed and talking, the table that looked like something from a different life, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Not quite pain, but close. The look of a man confronting something he'd thought was lost forever. He took his seat at the head of the table without speaking. Sam passed him a slice of pie and he ate it slowly, his eyes distant. After the meal, as the men drifted away to their evening routines, Rowan lingered in the kitchen doorway. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." Vivienne wiped down the counter, not looking at him. "But I wanted to." "Why?" "Because they needed it. Because this house needed it." She turned to face him. "You have good men here, Mr. Cade. Men who work hard and ask for very little. But everyone needs to feel valued occasionally. Everyone needs to remember what they're working for. And what are they working for? For you, for this ranch, for the idea that hard work and loyalty mean something." She paused. "And maybe, occasionally, for roast beef and apple pie." He almost smiled. Almost. "My mother used to do things like this. Big dinners for no reason except that she thought the men deserved them." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. He moved into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. She also had a way of seeing problems before they became disasters. You have that same quality. I simply pay attention. Most people don't. They see what they want to see and ignore the rest. He studied her with those sharp gray eyes. You saw the tension between Riley and Connor this morning. It was hard to miss. It's been building for weeks. I've been trying to figure out how to address it without taking sides or making it worse. You handled it better than I could have. I didn't handle anything. I just reminded them that they have more in common than they think. Exactly. He picked up a dish towel and began drying the plates she'd washed, working beside her with comfortable efficiency. Can I ask you something personal? Vivian's hand stilled in the soapy water. You can ask. Were you married? She looked at the wedding band she still wore out of habit. Yes. What happened? For a long moment she considered deflecting the question, but there was something about this quiet kitchen, this man who'd shown her kindness when she desperately needed it, that made her want to be honest. He died 2 years ago, she said quietly. Cancer. It was slow and painful, and by the end he was barely the man I'd married. She pulled her hands from the water and dried them carefully. After he was gone, I discovered that our finances were in ruins. He'd made bad investments, kept secrets, left me with nothing but debts, and a reputation ruined by his failures. So you came west to escape. I came west because staying meant spending the rest of my life being pitied and whispered about. Here, no one knows me. No one cares who I used to be. She met his eyes. I can be whoever I choose to be. And who do you choose to be? Someone useful, someone strong, someone who doesn't need rescuing. Rowan set down the towel. For what it's worth, Mrs. Laurent, I think you've already achieved that. The words settled into her like warmth on a cold day. Thank you. They finished the dishes in companionable silence. When the last plate was dried and put away, Rowan moved toward the door, then stopped. The trouble I mentioned when you first arrived, it's getting worse. Silas Vane has been escalating his tactics. 2 nights ago, someone cut the fence on the north pasture and scattered 50 head of cattle. It took us all day yesterday to round them up. Vivian's hands tightened on the counter. Is that why Connor and Riley were arguing? The stress? Partly. Everyone's on edge. We're short-handed because I can't afford to hire more men right now, which means everyone's working longer hours. Add sabotage to that, and, he shrugged, people snap. What does Vane want? My land, specifically my water rights. He's got a big operation to the south, but his water sources aren't reliable. Mine are. If he can force me to sell, or better yet, drive me to bankruptcy so he can buy the ranch for pennies, he'll control most of the water in this valley. Can't the law help? Rowan's laugh was bitter. The law is a day's ride away and spread too thin to care about fence cutting. Unless someone gets killed, we're on our own. Then what will you do? Keep fighting. What else can I do? He looked at her directly. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what you've walked into. This situation could get dangerous. If you want to leave, I'll drive you back to town tomorrow and pay you for the full week. Vivian lifted her chin. I'm not leaving. You should consider it seriously. I said I'm not leaving, Mr. Cade. I've dealt with bullies before. They may come in different forms out here, but the principle is the same. You stand your ground, or they take everything. Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. All right then, but if things escalate, I want you to stay in the house. Don't try to be a hero. I'll be as cautious as the situation requires. That's not the same as promising to stay safe. No, she agreed. It's not. He shook his head, but she thought she saw the ghost of a smile. You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Laurent. I've been called worse things. After he left, Vivian locked her bedroom door and sat down at her desk. She pulled out her journal and began writing, documenting everything she'd learned about the ranch, the men, and the situation with Silas Vane. It was a habit from her old life, keeping detailed records, paying attention to details others missed. She'd learned the hard way that information was power and preparation was survival. The next morning brought the first real evidence of just how serious Vane's campaign had become. Vivian was preparing breakfast when she heard shouting from the barn. She rushed to the window and saw men running, smoke rising in thick black plumes. The hay barn was on fire. Without thinking, she grabbed buckets from the kitchen and ran outside. The scene was chaos. Men forming a bucket brigade from the well, horses screaming in terror in the nearby corral, smoke so thick it burned her lungs. She joined the line without hesitation, passing buckets until her arms ached and her dress was soaked through. It took 2 hours to get the fire under control. By then, half the hay barn was destroyed, and they'd lost most of their winter feed stores. Rowan stood amid the smoking ruins, his face black with soot, his expression like carved stone. Sam approached him carefully. "Boss, we found these near the back wall." He held up several charred rags that reeked of kerosene. "This wasn't an accident." "I know." Rowan's voice was deadly quiet. "Get the men together. I want guards posted every night from now on. 2-man shifts, rotating every 4 hours. No one works alone. And someone rides into town today to file a report with the sheriff. Not that it'll do any good." "Yes, sir." Vivian watched Rowan survey the damage, saw the weight of it settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just lost hay. It was lost money, lost security, another piece of evidence that Vane was willing to destroy everything Rowan had built. She went back to the kitchen and started cooking. The men would need food, hot coffee, something to restore their strength and calm their nerves. By the time they straggled in, exhausted and defeated, she had a full breakfast waiting and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Eat," she said firmly when several of them tried to wave away the food. "You can't fight on an empty stomach." Riley sank into a chair, his face drawn. "We can't win this, can we? Vane's got more money, more men, more everything. He can keep hitting us until we break." "Then we don't break," Connor said sharply. The animosity between them had evaporated in the face of a common enemy. "We're not quitters." "Connor's right." Sam's voice carried authority. "We've dealt with worse before. We'll deal with this." But Vivian could see the doubt in their eyes. They were brave men, loyal men, but they were also practical. How long could they hold out against an enemy with unlimited resources and no scruples? After they'd eaten and dispersed to assess the full extent of the damage, Vivian found Rowan standing alone near the ruined barn. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Bad enough. That hay was supposed to feed our stock through the winter. Now we'll have to buy feed at premium prices, which we can't afford. We're already operating on thin margins." He kicked at a piece of charred wood. "Vane knows exactly what he's doing. He's bleeding us dry, one cut at a time." "Then we need to change the game." He looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "You can't beat him with resources. He has more money, more men, more power. But he has weaknesses too. Everyone does." "Such as?" Vivian chose her words carefully. "Arrogance. He thinks he's untouchable because he's won before. He thinks you'll fold because others have. That kind of confidence breeds carelessness." You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am. My late husband had business rivals who tried to destroy him. Some succeeded eventually, but the ones who failed always made the same mistake. They underestimated him because they thought they were smarter." She paused. "What do you know about Vane's operation, his business practices, the source of his money?" "Not much. He came to this valley about 5 years ago with money from back east, bought up several struggling ranches, consolidated them into one big operation. He's ruthless, but as far as I know, everything he does is legal." "As far as you know, but you haven't looked closely, have you?" "I've been too busy trying to keep my own ranch running." "Maybe it's time to look." Vivian met his eyes. "Men like Vane don't build empires without leaving bodies behind. If he's willing to burn your barn, he's done worse to others. Find those others, talk to them, build a case." Rowan stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You're not what you seem, are you, Mrs. Laurent?" "None of us are, Mr. Cade. We're all more than we appear." Over the next 2 weeks, the attacks continued. Fences cut, equipment sabotaged, a water trough poisoned, sickening 3 horses before they caught it. Each incident was small enough to be deniable, large enough to cost money and morale. But something else was happening too. The ranch was changing. Vivian's presence had brought a kind of order and dignity that had been missing. Meals were no longer just fuel, but events that brought the men together. The house was clean, organized, running smoothly. Small touches appeared, flowers on the table, curtains in the windows. the smell of fresh bread that made even the hardest days feel more bearable. And the men responded. They worked harder, complained less, supported each other through the constant stress of being under siege. Riley and Connor had become friends, united by adversity. Sam had started teaching the younger hands skills they'd need to run their own places someday. Even Rowan had begun to thaw, smiling occasionally, joining the evening conversations instead of disappearing into his study. Vivian found herself settling into this life in ways that surprised her. She'd expected to feel isolated, lonely, out of place. Instead, she felt useful, needed, part of something that mattered. She also found herself watching Rowan more than she probably should. He was not a man who revealed himself easily. He spoke little, showed less. But she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the tension in his shoulders that meant worry, the slight softening around his eyes when he was pleased. She'd learned that he took his coffee black, hated waste of any kind, and had a particular fondness for cherry pie. She'd also learned that he was desperately alone. One evening, after the men had gone to bed and the kitchen was clean, she found him in his study, surrounded by ledgers and bills. The lamplight cast shadows across his face, making him look older and more worn than his years. "You should rest," she said from the doorway. He looked up, startled. "I didn't hear you." "You were concentrating. May I come in?" He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Can't sleep?" "I'm not used to going to bed this early." Back in Boston, social events often lasted until midnight or later. "Do you miss it? That life?" Vivian considered the question honestly. "I miss certain aspects. The symphony, the libraries, conversations about books and ideas instead of cattle and fences." She paused. "But I don't miss the people. Most of them were shallow, cruel, or both. They'd smile to your face and destroy you behind your back. At least here people are honest about their cruelty." "Exactly." She looked at the papers scattered across his desk. "How bad is it, really?" Rowan leaned back in his chair. "We can survive the winter if nothing else goes wrong, but that's a big if. Vane knows we're vulnerable right now. He'll keep pushing until something breaks. What if we pushed back? With what? We're barely holding on as it is. Not with force, with information." Vivian leaned forward. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Vane buying up struggling ranches. Did he buy them, or did he force them to sell?" "What's the difference?" "Intent, method, legality." She tapped the desk. "If you use the same tactics on those ranchers that he's using on you, there might be a pattern, evidence, witnesses willing to testify." Rowan frowned. "That would require time and resources I don't have." "You have me." "Mrs. Laurent, hear me out. I can go into town, talk to people, ask questions. I'm a woman, middle-aged, non-threatening. People will talk to me. They'll tell me things they wouldn't tell you." "It's too dangerous. If Vane finds out..." "He won't. I'll be careful." She met his eyes. "Mr. Cade, I'm not just your cook. I'm someone who wants to see you win this fight. Let me help." He studied her for a long moment. "Why? Why does this matter to you?" Vivian thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The losses, the failures, the desperate need to prove that she was more than the wreckage of her old life. "Because you gave me a chance when no one else would," she said quietly. "Because this ranch has become something close to a home. And because I'm tired of watching bullies win." Rowan's expression softened. "You're a remarkable woman, Vivienne Laurent." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. "Is that a yes?" she asked. "It's a yes, but you have to promise me you'll be careful. Vane is dangerous." "I promise." 2 days later, Vivian took the ranch wagon into Ash Hollow. She wore her most respectable dress, pinned her hair carefully, and carried a shopping list that would justify the trip. But her real purpose was information. She started at the general store, chatting casually with the owner's wife about ranch life, the weather, the quality of the winter supplies. Then, carefully, she turned the conversation. "I've heard Mr. Vane runs quite a large operation. He must buy a lot of supplies from you." The woman's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "He does, though he's not the easiest customer." "Oh?" "Let's just say he expects special treatment, Discount prices, extended credit, and he's not always gracious when he doesn't get what he wants. Vivienne filed this away and continued her rounds. At the dry goods store, the seamstress, the boarding house, she asked the same gentle questions and received similar responses. Silas Vane was powerful, wealthy, and feared. People were careful about what they said, but between the lines, Vivienne heard the truth. He was also hated. Her most valuable conversation came at the boarding house, where Mrs. Brennan, after some careful prodding, revealed that 3 families had left the valley in the past 2 years after selling their ranches to Vane. The Hendersons, the McCarty family, and the Williamses, Mrs. Brennan said, lowering her voice. All of them claimed they were ready to retire or move on. But I knew those folks. They loved their land. Something drove them out. Do you know where they went? The Hendersons moved to Denver. The McCartys went to family in Kansas. The Williamses. She paused. I heard they ended up in Colorado Springs, running a boarding house like me. Vivienne made careful note of all of it. When she returned to the ranch that evening, she found Rowan waiting for her. Well? He asked. She told him everything she'd learned. He listened intently, his expression growing darker. If we could find those families, get them to talk about what really happened, he trailed off. It would take time. Letters, maybe visits. But it might give us leverage. Or it might put them in danger. They're already free of him. They might be willing to help if it means stopping him from doing to others what he did to them. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Start with letters. Carefully worded, no direct accusations, just inquiries about their experiences. If any of them respond positively, we'll know we're on the right track. That night, Vivienne drafted 3 letters at the small desk in her room. She wrote as a fellow rancher's employee, expressing interest in their experiences and their reasons for leaving the valley. She kept the tone friendly, sympathetic, non-threatening. She had no idea if any of them would respond. But it was a start. As winter deepened and the attacks continued, the ranch settled into a state of constant vigilance. But through it all, Vivienne kept the kitchen running, the men fed, and the house functioning. She became the steady heartbeat at the center of the chaos, the one constant in a world that seemed determined to fall apart. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to grow between her and Rowan. Not romance exactly. They were too practical, too scarred, too aware of all the reasons it would be complicated. But a partnership, a recognition that they were stronger together than apart. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The first response arrived 3 weeks later, on a morning when frost coated every surface and the air bit like teeth. Vivienne was kneading bread dough when Sam came into the kitchen with the mail, his expression carefully neutral. Letter for you, ma'am, from Colorado Springs. Her hand stilled. She wiped the flour on her apron and took the envelope, noting the careful handwriting, the quality of the paper. Thank you, Sam. He lingered in the doorway. That wouldn't be related to the questions you've been asking around town, would it? Vivienne met his eyes. I don't know what you mean. Ma'am, I've worked on this ranch for 8 years. I know when something's brewing. His voice was quiet, serious. Whatever you're doing, be careful. Vane has eyes everywhere. I'm always careful. After he left, she waited until the kitchen was empty before opening the letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the pages. Dear Mrs. Laurent, your letter brought back memories I've tried hard to forget. My husband and I ran a small ranch in Ash Hollow Valley for 12 years. We raised our children there, buried our parents there, thought we'd die there ourselves. But 3 years ago, Silas Vane made us an offer for our land. When we refused, things started happening. Fences cut, cattle scattered, our well poisoned, our youngest son beaten so badly he couldn't work for 2 months. We went to the sheriff. He said he couldn't prove anything. We hired guards. Vane hired more men. In the end, we had to choose between our land and our lives. We chose our lives. If you're asking these questions because Vane is doing the same thing to your employer, tell him to sell while he still can. Vane doesn't lose. He doesn't stop. And he doesn't care who gets hurt. I wish I could be braver. I wish I could testify or help you fight. But I have grandchildren now, and I can't risk them. I'm sorry. Margaret Williams. Vivienne read the letter 3 times, each word confirming what she'd suspected and making her blood run cold. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, then stood at the window watching the men work in the cold morning light. That evening, she showed the letter to Rowan in his study. He read it in silence, his face hardening with each line. "This is what we're up against," he said quietly. "This is what he does to people." It's also proof. Written testimony of his pattern of behavior. From someone too terrified to help us. Rowan set the letter down. "I can't blame her. She's protecting her family. But it establishes a pattern. If we can find others, build a case, we'll end up like the Williams family, driven out or worse." He stood and walked to the window, his back to her. "Maybe it's time to accept reality. Vane is going to win this fight. The only question is how much I lose before I admit it." Vivian felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "No." He turned to look at her. "No? No, you're not giving up. Not after everything you've fought for. Not after—" She stopped herself before she said too much. "Not after what?" "Not after showing me that there are still men in this world worth fighting for," she said quietly. "You gave me a chance when I had nothing. You built something good here, something that matters. I won't watch you surrender it to a bully." Rowan's expression was unreadable. "You've been here 2 months, Vivian. You don't have to tie yourself to my sinking ship." "It's not sinking, and I'm already tied to it." She moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines that worry had carved around his mouth. "Let me keep looking. Let me find the others. There has to be someone brave enough to stand with us. And if there isn't, then we find another way." She touched his arm, a brief contact that sent warmth through her glove. "Trust me." He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something shifted in his expression, surrender maybe, or hope. "I do trust you. That's what terrifies me." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the house. Sam burst into the study without knocking, his face pale. "Boss, we've got a problem. The cattle in the south pasture. Someone drove them through the fence into the canyon. We've got animals scattered everywhere, some injured, and there's a storm coming in." Rowan was moving before Sam finished speaking. "Get every available man mounted. We need to round them up before that storm hits or we'll lose half the herd." "Already done. But boss—" Sam hesitated. "We found tracks. Multiple riders, recent. They're probably still watching." "Then we ride careful." Rowan grabbed his coat and gun belt. "Vivian, stay in the house. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone you don't know." "Rowan, please." He stopped at the door, looking back at her. "Just this once. Don't argue." She wanted to protest, but the fear in his eyes stopped her. "Be safe." He nodded once and was gone. Through the window, she watched men mount horses and ride out into the gathering darkness. The wind was already picking up, carrying the smell of snow. Vivian locked the doors as instructed, then stood in the quiet house feeling useless and afraid. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Outside, the wind howled. She tried to distract herself with work, cleaning, organizing, preparing food for when the men returned, but her mind kept circling back to Rowan and the others riding through hostile territory in the dark. Hours passed. The storm broke with violent intensity, snow driving horizontal against the windows. Vivian kept the fires burning, the coffee hot, the lamps lit in every window to guide them home. It was past midnight when she heard the first riders return. She rushed to the door but kept it locked until Sam's voice called out, "Ma'am, it's us. Open up." She threw the bolt and yanked the door open. Sam and 3 other men stumbled inside, snow-covered and half-frozen. "Where's Rowan?" she demanded. "Still out there with Connor and Riley. They found most of the herd, but some animals are trapped in a ravine. They're trying to get them out before the storm gets worse." Sam's teeth were chattering. "We came back because the horses were done. Boss sent us to get fresh mounts and supplies." Vivian was already moving, filling thermoses with hot coffee, wrapping bread in jerky and oilcloth, grabbing blankets. "How bad is it out there?" "Bad? Visibility is almost 0. Temperature's dropping fast." He paused. "Ma'am, if they don't get those cattle out soon, they'll have to leave them. And if they wait too long, they might not make it back themselves. Her hand stilled. How long until you can ride back out? 10 minutes to switch horses and gear up. I'm coming with you. Ma'am, the boss said, I don't care what he said. He's been out there for 6 hours in this weather. You said yourself the temperature is dropping. If something goes wrong, if someone gets hurt, you'll need help. She grabbed her warmest cloak. I'm coming. Sam looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. You'll need better clothes than that. Come on. He led her to a storage room and pulled out heavy wool pants, a thick coat that had belonged to Rowan's father, boots lined with fur. She changed quickly, not caring about modesty or propriety. This was about survival. 10 minutes later, she was mounted on a steady mare, following Sam and the others back into the blizzard. The world had become a whiteout nightmare. She could barely see the horse in front of her, could only follow the dark shapes moving through the snow. The wind cut through her layers like knives. Her face went numb. Her hands, even in heavy gloves, ached with cold. They rode for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Then Sam raised his hand and they stopped. In the distance, Vivian could hear men shouting, cattle bawling, the chaos of animals and humans fighting against nature and fear. Sam guided them forward carefully. Through the driving snow, Vivian could make out the ravine, a deep cut in the earth where frightened cattle milled in confusion. 3 men on horseback were trying to drive them up the slope, but the animals kept slipping on the ice, falling, creating a dangerous tangle of bodies and horns. One of the riders was Rowan. Even through the snow, she recognized the way he sat his horse, the authority in his movements. He was working the upper edge of the ravine, trying to create an opening for the cattle to climb through. "Boss," Sam shouted, "we're here!" Rowan's head whipped around. Even at this distance, Vivian could see his expression change when he spotted her. "What the hell is she doing here?" His voice carried over the wind. "Saving your stubborn hide," she called back before Sam could answer. "Tell us what you need." For a moment she thought he'd order her to leave. Then another steer slipped and fell, nearly taking Connor's horse down with it, and Rowan's face hardened with decision. "We need to create a path up this slope. The cattle won't climb unless they can see a clear way out. Sam, take your men and work the lower end. Push them toward the opening Connor's making. Mrs. Laurent." He stopped, seeming to realize the absurdity of formality in a blizzard. "Vivian, I need you to position yourself at the top of the path and call to them. Use your voice. Let them hear something steady and calm." She didn't question the logic. She guided her mare to the position he'd indicated and began calling to the frightened animals. Her voice, trained in parlors and ballrooms to project without shouting, carried through the storm with unexpected strength. "Come on now, easy. This way. You can do it. Come on." It was absurd. It shouldn't have worked. But slowly, miraculously, the cattle began to respond. One cow found her footing and climbed toward Vivian's voice. Then another. Then a small group. The men worked in coordinated silence, pushing, guiding, encouraging. Vivian kept calling, her voice growing hoarse but never stopping. One by one, the cattle made it up the slope and onto level ground where Riley and Connor could herd them toward safety. They'd almost cleared the ravine when disaster struck. A steer, bigger and more aggressive than the others, panicked and charged back down the slope. It slammed into Rowan's horse, sending both animal and rider tumbling into the ravine. Vivian heard herself scream his name, saw him disappear beneath thrashing hooves and horns. Sam was moving before she could react, riding down into the chaos with a rope. Connor appeared on the other side, working to separate the aggressive steer from the others. Vivian sat frozen on her mare, her heart in her throat, unable to see through the snow and the mass of moving bodies, whether Rowan was alive or dead. Then Sam's voice cut through the storm. "I've got him! He's alive! Help me get him up!" Connor and Riley materialized beside Sam, and together they hauled Rowan out of the ravine and onto his horse. Even from a distance, Vivian could see blood on his face, the way he slumped in the saddle. "Get him to the house," Sam ordered. "We'll finish here." "I'm fine," Rowan said, his voice tight with pain. "We finished the job." "Boss, you're bleeding." "We finished the job." His tone left no room for argument. 5 more animals, then we go." They cleared the ravine in grim silence. When the last cow climbed to safety, Sam took Rowan's reins and began leading his horse toward home. Vivian rode beside them, watching Rowan sway in his saddle, terrified he'd fall. The ride back was a nightmare. The The storm had worsened and Rowan's condition deteriorated with every mile. By the time they reached the ranch house, he was barely conscious. "Get him inside," Vivian ordered, already dismounting. "Sam, help me. The rest of you see to the horses and get warm." They half-carried Rowan into the house and laid him on the sofa in his study. In the lamplight, Vivian could see the full extent of the damage. A deep gash above his left eyebrow, his shoulder hanging at an odd angle, blood seeping through his coat from wounds she couldn't yet see. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and the medical supplies," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Sam, his shoulder is dislocated. I'll need you to help me set it." "Ma'am, shouldn't we get the doctor?" "The doctor is in town, 6 miles away in a blizzard. We don't have that kind of time." She was already removing Rowan's coat, trying to be gentle, but knowing it would hurt. "I've done this before, but I need your help." Sam nodded and moved into position. Between them, they managed to remove enough of Rowan's clothing to see the injuries. The shoulder dislocation was bad, but fixable. The cut on his head needed stitches. There were bruises blooming across his ribs that suggested damage underneath. "This is going to hurt," Vivian told Rowan, who drifted back to semi-consciousness. "I'm sorry." "Just do it," he ground out through clenched teeth. She'd watched a doctor set her husband's dislocated shoulder years ago, had been forced to learn basic medical care when money had been too tight for frequent doctor visits. Now she drew on that knowledge, positioning her hands carefully, meeting Sam's eyes. "On 3. What?" She pulled on 2, and Rowan's shoulder snapped back into place with an audible pop. He made a sound like a wounded animal, but didn't cry out. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. "The worst is over," she said softly, already threading a needle. "Now hold still while I stitch this cut." She worked quickly and efficiently, her hands steady even though her heart was racing. Rowan watched her through pain-glazed eyes, his jaw tight. "You shouldn't have come out there," he said when she paused to rethread the needle. "If I hadn't, who would have helped Sam get you out of that ravine? That's not the point. You could have been killed. So could you, and you were." She met his eyes. "Don't tell me what risks I can take, Rowan Cade. I'll make my own decisions." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "Stubborn woman." "Stubborn man." She finished the stitches, bandaged the wound, and made him drink whiskey for the pain. Then she examined his ribs, pressing gently to check for breaks. He flinched, but didn't complain. "I think they're just bruised," she said. "But you need to rest. No work for at least a few days." "Can't. We just lost an entire day. The ranch will survive a few days without you. Sam can manage the crew." She covered him with a blanket. "Sleep. Doctor's orders." "You're not a doctor." "No, but I've kept more men alive than you have. So listen to me." This time the smile was definite, though pain still shadowed his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She sat with him until his breathing evened out in sleep, then went to check on the other men. They'd all made it back safely, cold and exhausted, but unharmed. She fed them hot food and sent them to bed, then returned to Rowan's study. He was still sleeping, his face pale, but peaceful. She added wood to the fire, adjusted the blanket, and sat down in the chair beside the sofa. She told herself she was just making sure he didn't develop a fever, but the truth was more complicated than that. Somewhere between serving him breakfast and stitching his wounds, between watching him fight for his ranch and feeling his blood on her hands, something had shifted inside her. She'd stopped thinking of him as her employer and started thinking of him as something far more dangerous. She'd started caring whether he lived or died. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Rowan woke before dawn, tried to get up, and nearly collapsed. Vivian, who dozed in the chair, was there to catch him. "What did I tell you about resting?" she demanded. "I'm fine." "You're injured and stubborn. Get back on that sofa or I'll have Sam tie you to it." He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in her rumpled clothes, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hair had come loose from its pins. "You stayed," he said quietly. "Someone had to make sure you didn't do something stupid in the middle of the night." "Vivian, don't." She helped him settle back onto the sofa. "Don't say anything you'll regret. You're injured and full of whiskey and probably not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking perfectly clearly." His hand caught hers, his grip warm and solid. "Thank you." for coming after me, for saving my life, for being here when I needed you. Her throat tightened. That's what partners do. Is that what we are? Partners? She looked at their joined hands, at his face in the early morning light, and felt something give way inside her chest. I don't know what we are, Rowan, but I know I'm not going anywhere. Even though it's dangerous, even though Vane is escalating, especially because of that, you need someone on your side who's too stubborn to quit. He smiled, real and genuine, and it transformed his whole face. I think I might need someone like that. They stayed like that for a moment, hands linked, something unspoken but powerful passing between them. Then Vivian gently pulled away and stood. Rest. I'll bring you breakfast. Vivian, she turned back. Last night, when you were calling to the cattle, I've never heard anything like it. Your voice cutting through the storm, steady and sure. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Heat flooded her face. It was just practicality. No, it was grace under pressure. It was courage. He paused. It was you. She fled before he could see how much his words affected her, before she did something foolish like cry or confess that somewhere in the past 2 months, she'd started falling for a man she'd promised herself she'd never depend on. The ranch settled into an uneasy rhythm over the next week. Rowan recovered slowly, chafing against enforced rest, but too injured to fight effectively. The men worked double shifts to make up for his absence and the time lost to the storm. And Vivian kept everything running, the kitchen, the household, and increasingly the subtle investigation into Silas Vane's past. 2 more letters arrived. One from Kansas, short and apologetic, declining to help. Another from Denver, longer and more hopeful. Mrs. Laurent, I was a foreman on one of the ranches Vane bought 5 years ago. I saw things that still keep me up at night. Intimidation, violence, systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way. But I also saw something else. Irregularities in his business dealings, money changing hands that didn't match official records, relationships with territorial officials that seemed closer than proper. I don't have proof. I was just a foreman. But I remember names, dates, patterns. If you're building a case against him, I might be able to help. But it would have to be done carefully. Vane has long reach and longer memory. Write back if you're serious. If you're brave enough to actually fight him, I might be brave enough to help. James Henderson. Vivian showed the letter to Rowan that evening. He read it twice, his expression thoughtful. This could be what we need, he said. Someone willing to testify about the pattern. Someone with specific information. Or it could be a trap. We don't know Henderson. We don't know if we can trust him. No, but we don't have many options. Rowan looked at her. What do you think? The fact that he was asking her opinion, treating her as an equal partner in this decision, made her chest warm. I think we write back, carefully, see what he knows. But we don't commit to anything until we're certain. Agreed. That night, they composed a letter together, sitting side by side at his desk, debating every word. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with trust. They were building something together, piece by careful piece. When the letter was finished and sealed, Rowan didn't immediately move away. Instead, he turned to look at her, his expression serious. Vivian, I need you to understand something. If we go down this path, if we really fight Vane, it's going to get worse before it gets better. He'll come after us with everything he has. I know. You could still leave, go back east, find a safer life. I don't want a safer life. I want this one. She met his eyes. I want to see you win. I want to see Vane lose, and I want to be here when it happens. Why? Why does this matter so much to you? She thought about all the reasons, all the complex emotions tangled in her chest. In the end, she chose honesty. Because for the first time in my life, I'm part of something that matters. Because you've shown me that strength doesn't mean brutality and kindness doesn't mean weakness. And because... She stopped, unsure how much to reveal. Because what? Because I care about what happens to you, she said quietly. More than I should. More than is probably wise. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Rowan's hand came up to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. Vivian. The sound of breaking glass shattered the moment. They both jumped to their feet as shouting erupted from somewhere in the house. Rowan grabbed his gun from the desk drawer and headed for the door, Vivian right behind him. They found Sam and two other men in the main room, staring at a brick that had crashed through the window. Tied to the brick was a note written in bold, threatening letters. "Sell now or bury your dead. Last warning. SV." Rowan's face went white, then red with fury. He crumpled the note in his fist and looked out the broken window at the empty darkness beyond. "He's done playing games," Sam said quietly. "This is a death threat, boss." "I know what it is." Rowan's voice was deadly calm. "Board up that window. Double the guards. And somebody ride to town first thing tomorrow and file a report with the sheriff." "That won't stop Vane," Connor said. "He's past caring about the law." "Maybe. But we're going to fight him the right way. We're going to build a case, gather evidence, and take him down legally." Rowan looked around at his men. "I won't ask any of you to risk your lives for this ranch. If you want to leave, I'll understand. But I'm staying, and I'm fighting." The men exchanged glances. Then Sam stepped forward. "We're with you, boss. All the way." One by one, the others nodded agreement. Even young Riley, barely 20, straightened his shoulders and said, "This is our home too. We're not running." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes at the loyalty, the courage, the fierce determination of these men who'd been paid to work cattle but had chosen to fight a war instead. Rowan saw her tears and moved to her side. "You don't have to stay for this," he said quietly. "This isn't your fight." She looked at the broken window, the threatening note, the men who'd become something like family. Then she looked at Rowan, at the strength and honor and stubborn courage that had drawn her from the first moment she'd seen him. "Yes," she said clearly, "it is." The attack came 3 nights later, swift and brutal. Vivian woke to the sound of gunfire and men shouting. She threw on her robe and rushed to the window, her heart hammering. In the yard below, figures moved through the darkness. Too many to be just the ranch hands. Muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning, and she could hear Sam's voice bellowing orders over the chaos. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside her fireplace and ran downstairs. Rowan was already in the main room, half-dressed, loading his rifle with hands that moved with deadly efficiency despite his still healing shoulder. "Get back upstairs," he ordered without looking at her. "What's happening?" "Vane's men, at least a dozen of them. They're trying to stampede the horses." He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her. His eyes were hard as flint. "If anyone gets past us and comes into this house, you use that poker. You don't hesitate. You understand?" She nodded, her mouth too dry for words. He touched her face, brief and fierce, then was gone into the night. Vivian stood frozen for a moment, listening to the battle rage outside. Then training from a life she'd left behind took over. She moved through the house systematically, checking locks, extinguishing lamps that would make targets of anyone inside, positioning furniture to block easy access to the upper floor. In the kitchen, she found the largest knife they had and tucked it into her belt alongside the poker. If they came for her, she would not go quietly. The gunfight lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours. Vivian crouched in the darkened hallway, listening to every shot, every shout, trying to identify voices and determine who was winning. She heard Riley scream, and her heart stopped, but then his voice came again, angry and alive, cursing someone's ancestry in creative detail. Finally, the shooting stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the nervous whinnying of horses and men's ragged breathing. Vivian waited, poker raised, until she heard Rowan's voice. "Clear! Everyone accounted for?" "All here, boss," Sam called back. "Riley took a graze to the arm, but he's fine. The bastards ran when we returned fire." Vivian sagged against the wall, relief making her knees weak. She set down the poker with shaking hands and went to open the door. The scene in the yard was chaos. Horses milled in confusion. Several sections of fence had been torn down, and in the dirt near the barn, they'd found something that made Rowan's face go white with fury. Bundles of dynamite, their fuses cut short but not lit. "They were going to blow the barn," Connor said, his voice shaking, "with all of us in it. If we hadn't heard them coming, but we did." Sam's hand was steady on the younger man's shoulder. "And they ran like the cowards they are." Rowan picked up one of the dynamite bundles, examining it with careful hands. "This is attempted murder. Not sabotage, not intimidation. Murder." He looked at Sam. At first light, you ride to town. Get the sheriff out here. Get the territorial marshal if you can. This has gone beyond a property dispute. Boss, the sheriff won't... I don't care if he's in Vane's pocket or not. We're going to make an official report, and we're going to make sure everyone knows what Vane tried to do here tonight. Rowan's voice was ice cold. He wants a war? He's got one, but we're fighting it my way, by the law and by the truth. Vivian watched him stride away toward the barn to assess the damage, his movements tight with controlled rage. She knew that fury, recognized the dangerous edge to it. She'd seen it in men before, the moment when restraint broke and violence became the only language that made sense. She followed him into the barn, where he stood staring at the place where the dynamite had been planted. In the dim lamplight, she could see his hands trembling. Rowan. He didn't turn. They could have killed everyone a bit. The men sleeping in the bunkhouse, the horses, you... His voice cracked. If they'd lit those fuses, this whole place would have gone up. But they didn't. We're all safe. This time. He finally turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes nearly broke her. How many more times, Vivian? How many more attacks before someone dies, before you... He stopped, jaw clenched. She moved closer, close enough to touch. Before I what? Before I lose you. The words came out raw and honest. I can't. I won't be responsible for your death. Tomorrow, I'm taking you back to town. You can stay with Mrs. Brennan until the stage comes through, and then you're going somewhere safe. No, this isn't a discussion. You're right, it isn't, because I'm not leaving. She lifted her chin, meeting his anger with steel of her own. You don't get to make that decision for me, Rowan Cade. I'm a grown woman who survived worse than Silas Vane, and I'll decide when and if I leave. Damn it, Vivian. No, you listen to me. She grabbed his shirt, forcing him to look at her. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But fear doesn't get to win. Vane doesn't get to drive me away from the first place I've felt at home in years, from the first people who've treated me like I matter. She paused, her voice dropping. From you. The air between them crackled with tension. Rowan's hands came up to grip her arms, not roughly but firmly, like he was trying to anchor himself. You matter too much, he said hoarsely. Don't you understand? If something happened to you because of my fight, because of my stubborn pride, it's not pride. It's principle. It's everything that makes you who you are. She softened, letting him see the truth in her eyes. And that's exactly why I'm staying, because men like you are rare and worth fighting for. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen. Then Rowan pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with desperate strength. She felt his heart hammering against her cheek, felt the tremor that ran through him. I can't lose you, he whispered into her hair. You won't. She held him just as tightly. I'm not that easy to kill. They stayed like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. When they finally pulled apart, something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained had burned away, leaving something raw and more honest in its place. Sam appeared in the barn doorway, tactfully clearing his throat. Boss, we've secured the perimeter. Riley's got his arm bandaged, and I found something you should see. They followed him to the torn section of fence. In the dirt, illuminated by lamplight, were fresh hoof prints and boot marks. But more importantly, there was a piece of fabric caught on a splintered fence rail. Expensive wool, the kind a wealthy rancher might wear. That's from a gentleman's coat, Vivian said, examining it carefully. Custom tailored, high quality, not what a hired gunman would wear. Rowan's eyes narrowed. So Vane was here himself, overseeing his hired thugs. Or participating, Sam's voice was grim. Boss, this changes things. If we can prove he was personally involved in tonight's attack, then we have him on attempted murder charges. Rowan took the fabric carefully. Bag this. Photograph the scene. Document everything. When the sheriff comes, I want evidence he can't ignore. Dawn broke gray and cold. The men worked through exhaustion to repair fences, calm horses, and restore order. Vivian fed them in shifts, keeping coffee flowing and food hot, watching Rowan move through the chaos with grim determination. By mid-morning, Sam had returned from town with news that made her stomach sink. The sheriff had refused to come out, claiming he was dealing with another matter. The territorial marshal was 3 days away at minimum. And worse, word was already spreading through Ash Hollow that the Triple C had been attacked, and that Vane was claiming it was actually Rowan's men who'd started the violence. "He's controlling the narrative," Rowan said quietly, reading Sam's report, "making us look like the aggressors while he plays the victim." "It's brilliant, really," Vivian said, her voice bitter. "He attacks us, then claims we attacked ourselves for sympathy. Who would believe such an outlandish story?" "People who want to believe it, people who are afraid to cross him." Rowan crumpled the paper. "We need that evidence from Henderson. We need proof of Vane's pattern of behavior, his business irregularities, something the law can't ignore." "I'll write to him again," Vivian said. "Press him for specifics. But Rowan, even if he gives us information, will it be enough? Vane has money, influence, connections. We're just what? Just a stubborn rancher and an elegant widow who won't quit?" Rowan's smile was fierce. "Vivian, that might be exactly what it takes to beat him. He's used to people folding under pressure. He doesn't know what to do with people who refuse to break." The response from James Henderson arrived 5 days later, carried by a private courier who'd been paid extra to avoid the regular mail routes. Vivian and Rowan read it together in his study, and with each paragraph their hope grew. Henderson had been thorough. He detailed financial irregularities in Vane's land purchases, money changing hands that wasn't recorded in official transactions, pressure applied to county officials, manipulation of property assessments. He named names, provided dates, described a systematic pattern of corruption that went far beyond simple business competition. But the most damning information came at the end of the letter. 3 years ago, a rancher named Thomas Mercer refused to sell to Vane. His barn burned down with him inside it. The official verdict was accidental, but I was there when Vane's men came back that night. I heard them laughing about it. I saw the kerosene cans. I've lived with that guilt for 3 years. I should have spoken up. I should have testified, but I was scared, and I had a family to protect. If you're brave enough to take Vane down, I'll testify. I'll tell everything I know. But you need to understand, this won't just be a legal battle. Vane will come after you with everything he has. You need to be prepared for that." Vivian set down the letter with trembling hands. "This is it. This is what we need." "It's a start." Rowan was already writing notes, planning strategy. "But Henderson's right. Testimony alone won't be enough. We need documentation, bank records, property transfer documents, anything that proves the financial irregularities he's describing." "Where would those records be kept?" "County office in Ash Hollow, but they're public record, heavily guarded, and—" He stopped, looking at her with sudden intensity. "And you could walk right in there without raising suspicion." "What do you mean? You're a widow managing her own affairs. You have every legitimate reason to review property records, understand local land values, research potential investments." His mind was clearly racing. "Vane's people watch me constantly. They watch my men, but they don't know you're involved in this. They think you're just the cook. You want me to spy on county records? I want you to legally review public documents that happen to contain evidence we need." He reached for her hand. "But only if you're willing. This is dangerous, Vivian. If Vane finds out what you're doing, then I'll be very careful not to let him find out." She squeezed his hand. "When do I go?" They spent 2 days preparing. Rowan taught her exactly what to look for: discrepancies in sale prices, transfer dates that didn't match official records, patterns of property changing hands immediately before Vane acquired them. Vivian practiced the role of an interested investor, rehearsing questions that would sound innocent but yield crucial information. On the 3rd day, she dressed in her most respectable traveling clothes and took the wagon to town. Her story was simple. She was considering investing her late husband's insurance money in local property and needed to understand land values and ownership patterns. The clerk at the county office, a nervous young man named Timothy, was happy to help such a refined lady. He showed her to the records room and left her with stacks of property transfer documents, tax assessments, and sale records. Vivian worked quickly and methodically, her years of managing household accounts making her sharp-eyed for inconsistencies. She found them everywhere. Properties sold to Vane at prices well below market value. Ownership transfers that happened within days of suspicious events, fires, floods, accidents. tax assessments that mysteriously changed right before Vane purchased land, making it appear less valuable than it was. She made careful notes, using a code Rowan had taught her that would look like investment calculations to anyone who glanced at her papers. By late afternoon, she had documented over a dozen suspicious transactions spanning 5 years. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across her table. Mrs. Laurent, what a pleasant surprise. She looked up into the cold eyes of Silas Vane himself. He was a large man, well-dressed, with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, from his custom-tailored suit to the heavy gold watch chain across his vest. Vivian's heart hammered, but she kept her expression pleasantly neutral. Mr. Vane, good afternoon. I heard we had a visitor from the Triple C reviewing property records. I was curious what Rowan Cade's cook would find so interesting about land transfers. His voice was pleasant, conversational, and utterly terrifying in its implication. Mr. Cade was kind enough to give me time off to attend to personal business. I'm considering investment opportunities in the valley. She gestured to the document spread before her. These are public records, as I'm sure you know. Of course. Public means anyone can review them. He moved closer, looking at her notes. That's quite detailed research for someone just considering investments. One might almost think you were looking for something specific. I believe in being thorough. I'm sure you do. He picked up one of her papers, examining it with interest that felt like a threat. You know, Mrs. Laurent, I've been hearing interesting things about you. A refined widow from Boston, suddenly working as a ranch cook in the middle of nowhere. It's an unusual trajectory. I needed a fresh start. And you found it with Rowan Cade. How convenient. He set down the paper carefully. Let me give you some advice, as someone who's lived in this valley far longer than you. Rowan is fighting a losing battle. His ranch is failing, his resources are depleted, and his pride won't let him admit defeat. Anyone who ties their fortunes to his will go down with him. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Vane, but my employment arrangements are my own business. Are they? He leaned against the table, looming over her. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're doing more than just cooking. It looks like you're conducting research into my business affairs. That's not employment, that's espionage. Vivian forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm reviewing public records as is my legal right. If my research happens to intersect with your business interests, that's because you own a great deal of property in this valley. I can hardly research land values without encountering your name. Clever answer, but let me be clear, Mrs. Laurent. All pretense of pleasantness dropped from his voice. I don't care if you're Cade's cook, his accountant, or his whore. If you interfere in my affairs, you'll regret it. The last people who tried to investigate me ended up leaving the valley in the middle of the night. Some of them didn't even make it that far. The threat hung in the air between them, naked and brutal. Vivian's hands wanted to shake, but she kept them still through sheer force of will. Are you threatening me, Mr. Vane? I'm educating you. There's a difference. He straightened, adjusting his coat. Enjoy your research, Mrs. Laurent, and give my regards to Rowan. Tell him I'll be seeing him very soon. He walked away, leaving Vivian sitting in the records room with her heart racing and her mind spinning. She waited until she was certain he was gone, then gathered her notes with trembling hands. She'd gotten what she came for, but Vane now knew she was involved. The game had changed. She returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, and Rowan met her at the door. One look at her face told him something had happened. What's wrong? She told him everything. When she finished, his face was white with fury. He threatened you. In a public building, in broad daylight, he threatened your life. He was careful not to say anything actionable, just implications and warnings. She set down her notes. But Rowan, I got the documentation. Everything Henderson described is here in the official records. The pattern is undeniable. He barely glanced at the papers. I don't care about the documentation right now. He knows you're helping me. He as good as said he'd hurt you if you continued. So we continue carefully. No, this is exactly what I was afraid of. He grabbed her shoulders, his eyes blazing. Vivian, you're leaving tomorrow. I'll arrange an escort to Denver, give you enough money to start over somewhere safe. Stop. She covered his hands with hers. Stop trying to protect me by sending me away. I knew the risks when I started this. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. Vane knows about you now. You're a target. I've been a target since the moment I stood beside you. The only difference is now it's official. She stepped closer, forcing him to really see her. I am not leaving you to fight this alone. Not now, not when we're this close. You could die. So could you. So could Sam, or Connor, or any of the men who've chosen to stay and fight. Her voice softened. We're all in this together now, Rowan, for better or worse. He pulled her against him, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I can't lose you, he whispered. I can't. You won't. She tilted her head back to look at him. We're going to win this. Together. The kiss, when it came, was inevitable. Fierce and desperate and full of everything they'd been holding back for months. Rowan kissed her like she was oxygen and he was drowning, and Vivian kissed him back with equal hunger, equal need. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. This is a terrible idea, he said. The worst, she agreed. If we survive this, if we actually beat Vane, when we beat him, she corrected. When we beat him, he amended with a small smile. I'm going to ask you to stay, not as my cook, as... He seemed to struggle with the words. As everything. Her heart swelled. And I'm going to say yes. Promise? Promise. They sealed it with another kiss, gentler this time, full of promise and hope, and the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful from the ashes of violence and fear. The next week brought a flurry of activity. Vivian organized the evidence she'd gathered, cross-referencing it with Henderson's testimony. Rowan wrote to the territorial marshal, laying out a detailed case of corruption, intimidation, and suspected murder. Sam drilled the men on defensive tactics and established round-the-clock guard rotations. They were preparing for war, but they were also building a legal case that could end it without more bloodshed. Then, on a bitter cold morning 2 weeks before Christmas, everything fell apart. Connor came racing into the yard on a lathered horse, his face stark with terror. Boss! Mrs. Laurent! You need to come now. They've got Riley. Vivian's blood turned to ice. What do you mean they've got him? He rode out to check the north fence like he does every morning. He's 2 hours overdue, and we found his horse wandering riderless. And this. Connor held up a piece of paper. It was tied to the saddle. Rowan took the note, and Vivian read over his shoulder. Your man for your ranch. Deed transfer by sundown tomorrow, or he dies. Come alone to Fletcher's Canyon at noon to negotiate. Bring the law, and he dies. Tell anyone, and he dies. You know I mean it. SV. The world seemed to tilt. Riley, barely 20 years old, with his whole life ahead of him, was in the hands of a man who'd already killed and would kill again without hesitation. We have to give him what he wants, Vivian heard herself say. The ranch isn't worth Riley's life. We're not giving him anything. Rowan's voice was cold with fury. This is a trap. If I show up alone, he'll kill us both and take the ranch anyway. Then what do we do? He looked at her, at Connor, at Sam who'd just arrived. We beat him at his own game. We go to Fletcher's Canyon, but we don't go alone, and we don't go unprepared. Boss, the note said, I know what the note said, and Vane knows I'll break every rule to save one of my men. He's counting on it. Rowan's smile was sharp and dangerous. So we give him what he expects right up until we don't. He gathered the men and laid out his plan. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was also the only chance they had. And for Vivian, watching him transform from wounded rancher to strategic commander, it was the moment she fully understood what kind of man she'd fallen in love with. Not just honorable or brave, but brilliant and fierce and utterly unwilling to surrender, even when surrender might be easier. As the men dispersed to prepare, Rowan pulled her aside. I need you to stay here. Absolutely not. Vivian, please. This is going to be dangerous, which is exactly why I'm coming. She grabbed the rifle Sam had been teaching her to shoot. Riley is family. This ranch is my home, and you... She met his eyes. You're going into danger. If you think I'm staying behind while you risk your life, you don't know me at all. He stared at her for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he smiled. Has anyone ever told you you're magnificent when you're being stubborn? Not recently. Well, you are. He kissed her, quick and hard. All right, you come. But you follow my lead, you stay behind cover, and if things go wrong, you run. Agreed? Agreed. They both knew she was lying, and they both knew he knew it. But sometimes love meant accepting that the person you treasured was just as stubborn and brave and foolish as you were. At noon the next day, they rode toward Fletcher's Canyon with the cold December sun beating down and their hearts in their throats, heading toward a confrontation that would decide everything. Fletcher's Canyon was a scar cut deep into the earth, its walls rising steep and unforgiving on both sides. The winter sun cast long shadows across the rocky floor, creating pockets of darkness where anything could hide. Vivienne felt her pulse hammering as they approached, every instinct screaming danger. Rowan rode beside her, his face carved from stone, his hand never far from his rifle. Behind them, at carefully staggered distances, came Sam and Connor. The rest of the men had split off an hour ago, taking hidden positions along the canyon rim according to Rowan's plan. Remember, Rowan said quietly, Vane expects me to come alone and desperate. That's our advantage. He thinks he's already won. What if Riley's already dead? Vivienne couldn't stop herself from asking. Then Vane loses his only leverage and he knows it. Riley's alive. He has to be. But she heard the doubt beneath his certainty, the fear he was trying to hide. They reached the agreed meeting point, a wider section of canyon floor where the walls created a natural amphitheater. And there, tied to a post driven into the frozen ground, was Riley. The young man's face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes blazed with fury rather than fear. When he saw them approaching, he tried to shout a warning, but the gag in his mouth muffled it to incomprehensible sounds. That's far enough, Cade. Silas Vane stepped out from behind a boulder, flanked by 6 armed men. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man holding all the cards. His expensive coat was pristine despite the rough terrain, his smile cold and satisfied. You came. I wasn't entirely certain you would. You have my man. Of course I came. Rowan's voice was flat, controlled. Let him go, and we'll talk terms. Terms? Vane laughed. There are no terms, Cade. You sign over your ranch to me, right here, right now, or young Riley dies. It's that simple. Nothing about this is simple. You're talking about theft, kidnapping, murder, crimes that will put you in prison for the rest of your life. Only if someone reports them. Only if anyone believes the word of a failed rancher over mine. Vane gestured lazily to his men. I have witnesses who will swear you attacked us, that we defended ourselves, that Riley died in the crossfire of your foolish rescue attempt. You've thought this through. I always do. That's why I win. Vane pulled a folded document from his coat. I had my lawyer draw up the transfer papers. Sign them, and Riley goes free. Refuse, and he dies right here in front of you. You have 60 seconds to decide. Vivienne watched Rowan's face, saw the calculation running behind his eyes. She knew what he was thinking, that he could sign the papers, get Riley to safety, and then fight to reclaim the ranch later. But she also knew Vane would never let any of them walk away alive. Show me he's unharmed first, Rowan said. Remove the gag. Let him speak. Vane shrugged and nodded to one of his men, who yanked the gag from Riley's mouth. It's a trap, boss! Riley shouted immediately. There's more men hidden in the rocks. They're going to kill you no matter what you... The man backhanded him viciously, cutting off his words. Enough, Vane said calmly. You've seen he's alive. Now sign the papers. Rowan dismounted slowly, and Vivienne followed suit. She could feel Vane's men watching her, see the calculation in their eyes as they assessed whether she was a threat. Let them underestimate her. She'd learned the power of being dismissed. I'll need to read the document, Rowan said, reaching for the papers. There's nothing to read. It's a simple transfer of property. I don't sign anything without reading it. That's basic sense. Vane's jaw tightened with impatience, but he thrust the papers toward Rowan. Fine. Read quickly. As Rowan unfolded the document, Vivienne moved slightly to the side, positioning herself where she had a clearer view of the canyon rim. She caught a flash of movement, sunlight on metal, and knew their men were in place. This gives you complete ownership of not just the ranch, but all water rights, mineral rights, and livestock. Rowan said, still reading. You've been thorough. I told you, I always am. There's one problem, though. Rowan looked up, and his smile was sharp as broken glass. These papers mean nothing without witnesses to verify I signed willingly, without coercion. And the only witnesses here are your hired guns, who everyone knows are on your payroll. I don't need witnesses. I have your signature. A signature obtained under duress with a kidnapped man as leverage. Any judge would throw this out in seconds. Rowan let the papers flutter to the ground. You didn't think this through as well as you thought, Vane. The rancher's face darkened with fury. You're in no position to negotiate, Cade. Sign the papers or watch your man die. No. Rowan's voice carried absolute conviction. You're going to let Riley go, and you're going to turn yourself in to the territorial marshal, because if you don't, the evidence we've gathered about your activities over the past 5 years is going to bury you. Vane's laugh was genuinely amused. What evidence? The ravings of a desperate man? The word of former employees with grudges? Documented financial irregularities. Testimony from multiple witnesses describing your pattern of intimidation and violence. Property records showing your systematic acquisition of land through coercion. Rowan's smile was cold. And a sworn statement from a man who saw you murder Thomas Mercer 3 years ago. The amusement drained from Vane's face. You're bluffing. James Henderson sends his regards. He's currently giving his full testimony to the territorial marshal, who, Rowan pulled out his pocket watch, checking it with deliberate calm, should be arriving in Ash Hollow right about now with a federal warrant for your arrest. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Vane's expression. You're lying. Am I? You want to gamble your freedom on that? Rowan's voice hardened. It's over, Vane. You pushed too far, threatened too many people, and left too much evidence. We built a case that even your money and influence can't defeat. Then you'll die before you can present it. Vane's hand moved toward his gun. Kill them all! The canyon exploded into chaos. Vane's men drew their weapons, but before they could fire, shots rang out from the canyon rim. Sam and Connor emerged from cover, rifles raised, and from positions all around the canyon, Rowan's men opened fire with devastating precision. Vivienne threw herself toward Riley, using the confusion to cut his bonds with the knife she'd hidden in her boot. The young man surged to his feet, grabbing a fallen rifle and moving to defend their position. Bullets ricocheted off rock. Men shouted and dove for cover. Vane's hired guns, caught in crossfire from multiple directions, began to break and run. But Vane himself stood his ground, his gun trained on Rowan with shaking hands. You ruined everything, he snarled. You self-righteous fool, you ruined everything. No, Rowan said calmly, his own weapon steady. You ruined yourself. I just made sure everyone saw it. Drop the gun, Vane. The voice came from the canyon entrance, where a man in a marshal's badge sat on horseback, flanked by 4 armed deputies. It's over. Vivienne's heart soared. The marshal had come early, intercepting their carefully timed plan and improving it. Henderson's testimony must have been even more damning than they'd hoped. Vane looked at the marshal, at the deputies, at his own men who were surrendering or fleeing. Slowly, the reality of his defeat settled over him. His gun hand lowered. This isn't over, he said, but his voice had lost its power. Yes, Rowan said quietly. It is. The marshal and his men took Vane into custody, along with 3 of his hired guns who'd surrendered. The others had scattered into the hills, and the marshal seemed content to let them go for now. Mr. Cade, the marshal said, dismounting. I'm Marshal William Hayes. Mr. Henderson's testimony was quite compelling. Combined with the documentation your Mrs. Laurent provided, we had more than enough for a warrant. When I learned about the kidnapping, I rode ahead of schedule. We're grateful, Marshal. Rowan shook his hand, then turned to check on Riley. You all right, son? Better now, boss? Riley's grin was shaky but genuine. Thanks for not giving up the ranch for me. I was never going to give it up, but I wasn't going to lose you either. Rowan gripped the young man's shoulder. You did good, staying strong. As the marshal organized his prisoners for the ride back to town, Vivienne found herself standing beside Rowan, watching Silas Vane being led away in shackles. The man who'd terrorized the valley, who'd driven families from their homes and killed to build his empire, looked small and defeated in the harsh winter light. It's really over, she said, hardly daring to believe it. The immediate danger is, but there'll be a trial, testimony, months of legal proceedings. Rowan took her hand, not caring who saw. I'm going to need you through all of it. I'm not going anywhere. He turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers. I mean it, Vivian, not just for the trial, for everything that comes after. I want you here as my partner, as... He took a breath. I'm not good with words, but I love you. I think I've loved you since the moment you stood up to Porter and his friends with nothing but dignity and courage, and I need you to know that before anything else happens. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, joyful tears. I love you too. I think I started falling for you the moment you fired that rifle to protect a stranger. You showed me what real strength looks like. Not cruelty disguised as power, but courage in service of principle. He kissed her there in the canyon, surrounded by his men and the marshal's deputies, not caring about propriety or appearances. And when they finally pulled apart, Sam was grinning like a fool, and Connor was trying hard not to cry. About damn time, Sam muttered, and several of the other men laughed. The ride back to the ranch felt like emerging from a dark tunnel into sunlight. Riley insisted he was fine, though Vivian made mental notes to check his injuries properly once they were home. The men were jubilant, their voices rising in celebration as they processed what had just happened. They'd won. Against impossible odds, outmanned and outgunned, they'd won. But the victory felt fragile to Vivian, like something that might still slip away if she didn't hold it carefully. It wasn't until they crested the final hill and saw the Triple C spread out below them, smoke rising from the chimneys, horses in the corrals, the barn standing solid and whole, that she let herself believe it was real. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. The territorial marshal took statements from everyone involved. Henderson arrived to give his testimony in person, a quiet man in his 50s who'd clearly been carrying guilt for years and seemed lighter for having unburdened it. The evidence Vivian had gathered from the county records proved crucial in establishing the pattern of Vane's corruption. More witnesses came forward once word spread that Vane had been arrested. Families he'd driven out, business owners he'd intimidated, officials he'd bribed, all of them suddenly found the courage to speak up. The case against him grew from solid to ironclad. Through it all, Vivian kept the ranch running. She cooked meals that brought the men together. She managed the household accounts with an efficiency that made Rowan shake his head in admiration. And slowly, carefully, she began adding her own touches to the house. Curtains in colors she loved, books on the shelves, small changes that transformed it from his space to theirs. One evening in late January, as they sat together in his study reviewing accounts, Rowan set down his pen and looked at her. The prosecutor says the trial will probably happen in March. After that, assuming Vane is convicted, things should settle down. Good. The ranch needs time to recover. She noted a supply order that seemed high. We're spending a lot on feed. The winter stores from the barn fire? Yes. We'll be tight on money until spring, but we'll make it. He paused. Vivian, I need to ask you something. The seriousness in his tone made her set down her own pen. What is it? The prosecutor wants you to testify about your research, the documentation you found, your encounter with Vane at the county office. He took her hand. It would mean standing in court, being questioned by Vane's lawyers, having your past examined. They'll dig into why you came west, what you were running from. It won't be pleasant, but it's necessary. Only if you're willing. We have Henderson's testimony, the financial records, other witnesses. Your testimony would strengthen the case, but it's not make or break. Vivian thought about it. Thought about standing in a courtroom, facing down the man who'd threatened her life. Thought about lawyers probing into her past, exposing her losses and failures to public scrutiny. Then she thought about the families Vane had destroyed, the people too afraid to speak up, the justice that would only come if everyone who could testify actually did. I'll do it, she said firmly. I'm not afraid of him anymore. And I'm not ashamed of my past. It made me who I am. Rowan's smile was pure pride. You're remarkable. I'm practical. And I want to see him pay for what he's done. The trial, when it came in March, lasted 3 weeks and drew spectators from across the territory. Vivian testified on the second week, spending 2 days on the stand answering questions about her research, her findings, and her confrontation with Vane. The defense lawyer tried to paint her as a scorned woman seeking revenge, as an opportunist who'd latched onto Rowan's cause for her own benefit. But Vivian met each insinuation with calm, factual responses that made the lawyer look desperate and small. When the prosecutor asked her why she'd risked so much to help build the case against Vane, her answer was simple and honest. Because I've watched bullies destroy good people my entire life. I've seen how they use fear and money and power to crush anyone who stands against them, and I was tired of watching them win. She looked directly at Vane, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. Mr. Cade and his men showed me that courage and principle can defeat corruption. I helped them because it was the right thing to do, that's all. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: intimidation, extortion, arson, kidnapping, and second-degree murder in the death of Thomas Mercer. Vane was sentenced to 30 years in territorial prison. When the verdict was read, Vivian felt Rowan's hand find hers. She turned to see tears on his face, not of sadness, but of relief and vindication and the release of years of pressure. "It's over," he whispered. "It's really over." "Yes," she said, squeezing his hand. "Now we can begin." Spring came to the valley with an explosion of green and gold. The ranch, freed from the constant threat of sabotage, began to thrive. Rowan hired 2 new hands to help with the increased workload, and the crew worked with renewed energy and hope. In April, Vivian received letters from 2 of the families that Vane had driven out. They wanted to come back, to reclaim their land now that it was safe. She and Rowan spent hours helping them navigate the legal process of recovering their property, witnessing the joy of people returning to homes they'd thought lost forever. On a warm evening in May, with the ranch house windows open to the smell of sage and wildflowers, Rowan found Vivian in the kitchen preparing dinner. He'd been quieter than usual all day, almost nervous. "I need to show you something," he said. "Will you come with me?" Curious, she wiped her hands and followed him outside. He led her past the barn, past the corrals, to a spot overlooking the valley where the sunset painted everything gold and crimson. "My father used to bring me here when I was a boy," he said quietly. "He'd tell me that this land was worth fighting for, worth sacrifice, worth building a life on." He turned to face her. He was right, but he never told me that the land alone wasn't enough, that what makes a place worth fighting for is the people you share it with. Vivian's heart began to race. "I know we haven't known each other long. I know this has all happened fast in the middle of chaos and danger, but I also know that you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. You saved this ranch. You saved me." He took her hands. "Vivienne Laurent, will you marry me? Will you stay here not as my cook or my partner, but as my wife? Will you help me build something lasting on this land?" She couldn't speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Instead, she kissed him, long and deep and full of yes. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying, he pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. "It was my mother's. If you don't like it, we can get something else." "It's perfect," she whispered as he slid it onto her finger beside the wedding band she'd finally removed from her previous marriage. "Everything is perfect." They were married in June, on the ranch, with all the hands in attendance and half the valley besides. The families they'd helped return brought food and gifts and gratitude. Henderson came from Denver with his whole family. Even the marshal attended, looking pleased with how the whole affair had turned out. Vivian wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Rowan had ordered specially from Denver, simple and elegant cream-colored silk that caught the sunlight. She carried wildflowers from the meadow where they'd first confessed their feelings. As she walked toward Rowan, standing tall and proud in his best suit with Sam as his best man, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The losses and failures, the desperate flight west, the moment in Ash Hollow when 3 men had cornered her and a stranger had fired a rifle to protect her. Every painful step had led to this, to him, to home. The ceremony was simple, officiated by a circuit judge who'd known Rowan's father. When it came time for the vows, Rowan's voice was steady and sure. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to value your strength and your grace, to build a life with you that honors both of us." He paused, his eyes shining. "You saved me, Vivian. Not just the ranch, but me. You reminded me what it means to fight for something that matters. I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of you. Vivian's own vows came from the deepest part of her heart. I promise to be your partner in all things, to bring you peace when you're troubled, strength when you're weak, and laughter when times are hard. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You gave me purpose when I'd lost hope. I will love you fiercely and faithfully for all my days. When the judge pronounced them married, the cheer that went up could probably be heard in town. Sam had to wipe his eyes. Riley was openly crying, and Connor started a toast that lasted well into the evening. The celebration continued long after sunset. Tables laden with food that Vivian had spent days preparing covered the yard. Music played. Someone had brought a fiddle, someone else a guitar. People danced and laughed and told stories about the battle against Vane that were already becoming legend. Late in the evening, Vivian stood on the porch watching it all, marveling at how much had changed in less than a year. She'd arrived in Ash Hollow alone, nearly broken, carrying nothing but loss and the desperate hope for a fresh start. Now she was surrounded by family, not blood, but the kind forged through shared struggle and mutual respect. Now she had a home that was truly hers. Now she had a partner who saw her clearly and loved her fiercely. Rowan appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. Happy? Beyond words. She leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of him, the warmth. Are you? More than I ever thought possible. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Thank you. For what? For being brave enough to stay when every sensible person would have run. For seeing something worth fighting for in a failing ranch and a broken man. For being exactly who you are. She turned in his arms to face him. We saved each other, Rowan. That's what partners do. Is that what we are? Partners? She smiled, remembering when he'd asked her that question months ago, before everything had changed. Partners, lovers, friends, survivors. She stood on her toes to kiss him. Everything. The party continued around them, but in that moment it was just the two of them, two people who'd found each other in the midst of chaos and built something stronger than fear, more lasting than violence. 6 months later, as winter returned to the valley, Vivian stood in the kitchen she'd claimed as her domain and looked at the life she'd built. The ranch was thriving, profitable for the first time in years. The men who worked there were happy, well-fed, treated with dignity. The house itself had transformed into a real home, warm and welcoming and full of laughter. And Rowan, her husband, her partner, her home, sat at the table going through accounts, occasionally asking her opinion on purchases or decisions. They worked together seamlessly now, each bringing different strengths, each trusting the other completely. Riley burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Boss, Mrs. Cade! The Henderson family just rode in. They say they've got news about the appeal." Vane's lawyers had filed an appeal, claiming procedural errors in the trial. It was expected, but still worrying. Vivian and Rowan exchanged glances, then headed outside to meet their visitors. James Henderson dismounted with a grin so wide it could have split his face. It's over. The appeals court upheld the verdict. Vane's going to serve every day of that 30-year sentence. Relief washed through Vivian so powerfully she had to steady herself against Rowan. It was truly over. Completely, finally, legally over. There's more, Henderson continued. Several of the smaller ranchers have banded together to form a valley association. Fair pricing, mutual aid, protection against anyone trying what Vane did. They've asked if you'd be willing to serve on the governing board. Rowan looked at Vivian, silently asking her opinion. She nodded. This was right, using what they'd learned to protect others, building something positive from the ashes of Vane's corruption. We'd be honored, Rowan said. That evening, after the Hendersons had left, and the men had been fed and the house had settled into quiet, Vivian and Rowan sat together in their bedroom. Through the window, they could see stars scattered across the black sky, brilliant and infinite. Do you ever regret it? Rowan asked quietly. Leaving your old life? Everything you knew? Vivian thought about Boston, about the society she'd once belonged to, about the woman she'd been before loss and hardship had reshaped her. No, she said honestly, that life was built on appearances and lies. This one is built on truth and work and love. I know which one I prefer. Even with all the danger, All the hardship? Especially because of it. We earned this life, Rowan. We fought for it. That makes it more precious than anything I had before. She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. Besides, I found you. And that alone makes every hard mile worth it. He pulled her close, and they sat like that for a long time, content in the silence and each other's presence. The years that followed brought their share of challenges, harsh winters, difficult seasons, the normal struggles of ranch life. But they faced each challenge together with the same stubborn determination that had defeated Vane. The ranch grew and prospered. The Valley Association flourished, bringing stability and cooperation to all the ranchers. New families moved in, drawn by the promise of fair dealing and honest community. And at the center of it all was the Triple C, known throughout the territory as the ranch run by the partnership of Rowan and Vivian Cade, him with his quiet strength and unwavering principles, her with her elegant steel and fierce intelligence. People told stories about them, especially about the battle against Silas Vane. The tales grew more elaborate with each telling, but the heart of them remained true. A story of courage against corruption, of ordinary people refusing to be crushed by powerful villains, of love born from mutual respect and tested by fire. Vivienne Laurent, who'd arrived in Ash Hollow with nothing but 2 trunks and a desperate hope, had become Vivian Cade, the woman who'd helped save a valley. She'd come west looking for a fresh start and found instead a purpose, a family, and a love deeper than anything she'd imagined possible. And Rowan Cade, who'd been fighting alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to have a true partner, had found in her not just a wife, but an equal, someone who made him stronger, braver, better than he'd ever been on his own. Together, they proved that grace and grit could ride side by side, that elegance and strength weren't opposites but complements. They built a legacy not of wealth or power, but of integrity, courage, and the fierce belief that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And on cold winter nights, when Vivian stood in her warm kitchen making dinner for the family they'd built, whether that was the ranch hands gathered around the table or in later years the children they'd raised together, she would sometimes remember that terrified woman standing in an Ash Hollow alley, surrounded by threats, wondering if she'd made a fatal mistake coming west. She'd smile, grateful beyond words that she'd been wrong. Coming west hadn't been a mistake. It had been salvation. It had been the beginning of everything that mattered. It had been, quite simply, the best decision she'd ever made. And in those moments, surrounded by warmth and laughter and the solid presence of the man she loved, Vivian Cade would lift her chin with that same dignity she'd carried even in her darkest moments, and she would know with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home.